What would you do if the man chosen to guide your life was the same one who should have only been your protector? Imagine a wedding where the bride's veil hides more than her tears, concealing not just her face but the truth of her bloodline. A union sealed not in love, but in silence, in obedience, in fear. That night, America witnessed something it never dared to record in history books: a girl forced into marriage with her own uncle, hidden away in a small community where secrets were buried deeper than graves. Her story begins not with joy, but with dread. In that dimly lit church, the air reeked of candle wax and mildew, and every whispered prayer seemed to carry a note of unease. The wooden ring slipped onto her finger was carved crudely, uneven, like the life that was being forced upon her. The cracked mirror in the back of the chapel reflected her pale face, her eyes wide with something between terror and resignation. She was a bride, yes, but also a child, barely stepping into womanhood, bound forever to a man who should have been only family. The witnesses who gathered that day said little. A few clutched their hymn books tightly, their knuckles white, their voices trembling as they mumbled through the verses. Others avoided looking at the altar at all, their eyes fixed on the floor, as if by refusing to see. They could escape complicity, but none left. Not a single one walked out of the ceremony. In that silence, the community became accomplices to a crime wrapped in holy vows. If you are passionate about incest stories in history and their tragic endings, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss a new video every week. Subscribe now and join me on a journey back through time. Tell me where you are and what time it is as you listen to this story, because the hour matters, and some stories change depending on when they're told. The bride's story did not end at the altar. That was only the beginning. The first step into a darkness that would stretch across her entire life, pulling her deeper with every year. And what happened after the vows, after the veil was lifted, was far more horrifying than anyone dared to whisper. She was born into a house where the walls seemed to listen, a wooden cabin, leaning on the edge of a forgotten valley, its beams blackened by years of smoke and mildew. The floor creaked under every step, as if echoing the weight of secrets too heavy for any child to bear. Her birth certificate, now yellowed and crumbling, bore a name scratched hastily in ink, a father listed with no certainty, a mother whose eyes had long since learned to look away. Even as an infant, her story was marked by silence. The family she entered was one bound by necessity and shame. Poverty clung to them like a second skin. Men worked the mines until their lungs filled with dust, while women carried babies year after year, their faces hardened before their time. The girl, small and frail, learned early that hunger was constant and that love was never free. When she reached for affection, she found only rough hands and eyes that lingered too long. She carried those gazes like invisible scars. There were signs, even then, that her childhood was no ordinary one. Neighbors remembered how she wandered the woods at night, barefoot, clutching a broken doll missing its face. They whispered about the songs she sang tuneless, eerie, echoing across the hills like laments from another world. Her uncle, already a looming figure in her young life, often appeared at her side during these midnight wanderings. Some said he watched over her like a guardian. Others, more observant, said the way he lingered was not the way a man should look at a child. Inside the house, strange objects became part of her world: a lock of hair kept inside a wooden box, a painting of a faceless bride tucked beneath her mattress, a cracked mirror propped against the wall where she often stared until her reflection blurred into something unrecognizable. She touched these things with an odd reverence, as if they carried meaning only she understood. And perhaps, in her silent heart, she did. Childhood for her was not a garden of laughter, but a corridor of shadows. Each step she took deeper into that valley was one step closer to the fate waiting for her. And though no one said it aloud, everyone seemed to know. The silence was not ignorance, it was complicity. Time moved forward, but for her, it did not bring freedom. The girl grew taller, her features sharpening, but each change in her body seemed less like a sign of life and more like a warning of what awaited. Her childhood voice, once fragile, took on an eerie stillness. She rarely laughed. Instead, She carried herself as though she were already marked, already chosen for something she never asked to bear. The uncle's shadow grew longer with every year. He became both provider and predator, hovering at the edge of her days. He brought her gifts that were not gifts at all, a lock of hair tied with twine, a wooden ring whittled in silence, the faint scent of tobacco and sweat lingering on the fabric of her dresses after he touched them. To outsiders, it looked like care. To her, it felt like chains. The house, too, shifted at night. The air was heavy with strange smells: burnt tallow, mold, the acrid smoke of damp wood. The boards groaned as though something unseen walked just beneath them. She lay awake listening, hearing not only footsteps, but whispers, low and slithering, as though the walls themselves had learned to speak her fate. Her dreams were no refuge. They filled with images of fire-lit halls, corridors without doors, the faceless bride from the hidden painting reaching out to her with skeletal hands. By her 16th year, the transformation was undeniable. She carried herself like someone walking through a storm, hair clinging damp to her skin, eyes glassy and haunted. Neighbors saw her pass with baskets of water, her hands trembling as though carrying far more than weight. Some turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others whispered that she was cursed, that her family had tied her to something darker than poverty. And through it all, her uncle waited. His presence was constant, his gaze unblinking. She sensed it in the corners of rooms, in the hush that followed when he entered, in the prickling of her skin when his hand brushed too close. There was no escape. Her transformation was not her own. It was his making, his design, his hunger shaping her path. The girl who should have grown free was instead being carved, piece by piece, into a bride. The family's silence might have held her captive, but outsiders began to notice what was happening. They came not as saviors, but as uneasy witnesses, catching fragments of a story too grotesque to be spoken openly. A traveling priest, summoned one winter to bless the house after rumors of illness, later wrote in his diary that the girl's eyes were those of a prisoner, though no bars could be seen. He described the uncle's hand resting too long on her shoulder, the way she flinched as though touched by fire. The entry ends abruptly, as if he feared writing more would damn him too. Doctors came as well, called for sudden fevers and fainting fits. One physician noted in his ledger the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, the way she refused to meet his gaze. He prescribed tonics, but in the margins. He scribbled darker observations, unnatural proximity. The uncle always present, that page, torn at the corner, was later found in a collection of medical records, a ghost of a truth never admitted. Neighbors whispered over fences and in fields. They spoke of hearing cries at night, muffled quickly, like a song strangled before it could take shape. They recalled the smell of burning cloth drifting from the chimney in midsummer, and the sound of someone singing low, a man's voice followed by the broken sobs of a girl. Yet none of them stepped inside. They told themselves it was not their place, not their fight. Silence was safer. And then there were the documents, scattered fragments that survived where voices failed. A letter written in a slanted hand begged for help, but never named the uncle outright, as though the girl herself feared the words might come alive if she wrote them. A torn lock of her hair was sealed inside, the strands brittle with age, found decades later in the attic of a courthouse. These traces, these scraps of paper and whispers, were all that remained of those who dared to witness and yet did nothing. The world outside had glimpsed her captivity, and still, it turned away. She was left alone, unseen, except by the one man who refused to release her. The night of the wedding was no celebration. The church stood shrouded in mist, its steeple barely visible under a pale, watchful moon. Inside, the pews were empty but for a handful of neighbors who sat stiffly, their voices hushed, their prayers muttered as though to shield themselves from guilt. The bride's veil trembled as she walked, her steps uneven, her hands clutching the bouquet so tightly that petals snapped and fell to the floor like broken promises. The wooden ring slid again onto her finger, this time not as a child's token, but as a seal of ownership. When the vows were spoken, the silence was suffocating. No music, no laughter, only the creak of the boards beneath their feet and the faint hiss of a candle guttering in the draft. To those present, the air seemed heavier, as though the building itself disapproved of the union taking place within its walls. That night, the house glowed faintly in the valley, its windows shuttered tight behind them. What unfolded was never fully written, never openly told, but whispers endured. Some claimed screams echoed through the walls, sharp and panicked, then cut short by silence. Others spoke of the smell of fire flesh, cloth, something unholy burning. A cracked mirror in the bedroom was later found scorched, its surface warped, as if it had reflected something too monstrous to hold. By morning, the girl's eyes were said to be vacant, her body rigid, her voice locked away. Neighbors passing by swore they saw her face pale as wax, staring through a narrow crack in the shutters. Her uncle, now her husband, stood beside her with a smile that never touched his eyes. No one dared ask what had happened in that room, but everyone knew. They saw it in the way her hands trembled, in the way she recoiled when he reached for her. The wedding had bound her to more than a man. It had bound her to a lifetime of silence, of violence hidden behind closed doors. The cries of that night did not vanish. They lingered, a curse that clung to the house, to the valley, and to every person who chose to say nothing. What followed was not healing, but haunting. The marriage became a cage that stretched across years, its bars made not of iron, but of secrecy and shame. Neighbors told stories in fragments, each retelling darker than the last. They said the house seemed to breathe at night, windows fogging as if with the exhale of unseen lungs. The cries, once sharp, dulled into low moans, then silence, broken only by the sound of a man's voice singing old hymns, off-key, while another voice, hers, remained forever muted. Documents surfaced long after the tragedy: a birth certificate for a child with no father's name, a doctor's note, half torn, describing deformities no one dared to explain, a diary entry smudged with ink, the words "I cannot escape" scratched again and again until the page nearly tore. These artifacts became the echoes of a life reduced to paper scraps, their meaning undeniable yet never fully spoken aloud. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the child born of that union vanished within weeks, carried out under a heavy blanket and never seen again. Others swore the girl herself disappeared one autumn evening, her wedding dress found hanging from a tree, its fabric damp and blackened with soot. And then there were those who believed she never left at all, that her presence still lingered in the valley, glimpsed in the corners of cracked windows, felt in the sudden chill of an empty room. Even generations later, when strangers stumbled upon the valley, they found remnants of her curse, a wooden ring buried beneath the hearth, a mirror cracked clean through, reflecting not the viewer but a faceless bride, locks of hair woven into the beams of the attic. Each discovery reignited whispers that her story had never ended, that the bloodline had carried its stain forward into the present. The past did not vanish. It simply shifted, taking new forms, finding new voices, latching onto those who came too close. Her silence had become a curse, one that refused to die with her. The valley grew quiet over time, but the silence was never peace. It was the residue of a wound that never healed. Those who walked past the ruins of the house spoke of shadows flickering in broken windows, of whispers rising with the night air, of the faint smell of smoke where no fire burned. The story of the hidden bride lived on not through her voice, but through the fragments she left behind, stitched together by fear and rumor. Her name, when spoken, carried unease. Old records kept in county archives listed her as both niece and wife. The words pressed side by side in faded ink. A letter tucked between those pages asked a question no one ever answered. What does blood mean when it becomes a chain? The question still lingers, centuries later. As if waiting for someone brave enough to reply, she had been forced into a role that defied nature itself: daughter, niece, bride, victim, and yet, within her silence, she left behind a kind of mirror, a reflection of the darkness that can grow when a community looks away. Her story reminds us that curses are not supernatural, they are born of choices, of neglect, of complicity. As the years wore on, the memory of her suffering became a warning. Parents told their children not to wander near the valley at night, not because of wolves or ghosts, but because of the weight of the past pressing down on the earth. Travelers felt it in their bones, a chill, a prickle along the skin, as though unseen eyes watched them from within the trees. Her story does not end neatly. It stretches across generations, a scar that refuses to fade, and it leaves behind one final question. one that can never be answered lightly. If you carried that bloodline, what would you do? The story of the hidden bride is not just a tale of one girl, one marriage, or one family. It is the echo of a truth that lingers whenever silence takes the place of courage. She lived and died under the weight of choices made not by her, but around her choices whispered in locked rooms, signed on fragile papers, sealed with rings carved from wood. And yet, her memory endures, not because it was celebrated, but because it was buried, and buried things never truly disappear. There is something profoundly human in the way her tragedy lives on, not in statues or monuments, but in fragments, a diary page, a lock of hair, a mirror cracked clean through. These objects are more than relics. They are symbols of lives bent until they broke, of innocence taken and never returned. They remind us that curses are not born from the supernatural, but from the cruelty of men and the silence of those who look away. If we listen closely, her story is more than horror. It is a mirror held up to the living, reflecting our own fears, our own complicity. For what happened to her was not an accident of fate. It was a choice. The choice of a man who claimed ownership where there should have been protection. The choice of a family who allowed shadows to grow unchecked. The choice of a community that stayed seated when it should have stood. And so her voice speaks not through words, but through the silence she left behind. A silence heavy enough to cross generations, to ask us, what do we allow when we refuse to see? What bloodlines do we carry? Not of kinship, but of memory and guilt. Her story ends, but its echo belongs to us.